Boundaries and belonging are often spoken about as if they exist on opposite sides of a line, one restrictive, the other warm and inclusive. In reality, they are deeply interconnected, especially within families where emotional history, unspoken expectations, and identity are tightly woven together. The tension between the two does not arise because boundaries are harmful, but because they are frequently communicated without care, context, or emotional awareness. When this happens, a boundary that is meant to protect can easily be experienced as rejection, and a limit that is practical can feel like the withdrawal of love. Belonging is not simply about being included in events or decisions. It is the emotional assurance that one's presence is valued, that one's role is secure, and that one does not need to compete for relevance. In families, belonging is often assumed rather than expressed. Parents assume it is permanent. Children assume it is unconditional. Over time, these assumptions harden into expectations, and expectations, when unmet, quickly transform into pain. When a boundary is introduced without acknowledging this underlying emotional contract, it can feel like a rupture rather than a clarification. A boundary at its healthiest is a statement of capacity. It says, "This is what I can offer without resentment," or "This is what I need in order to function well." It is not meant to define worth or rank people by importance. However, in family systems, boundaries are rarely received in isolation. They are filtered through memory. A simple limit can awaken old insecurities, fears of being replaced, forgotten, or no longer needed. This is why the same boundary that feels reasonable to one person can feel devastating to another. The emotional difference between setting limits and withdrawing belonging lies in the presence or absence of reassurance. When limits are communicated without affirming connection, the nervous system of the listener fills in the gaps. Silence becomes meaning. Ambiguity becomes threat. The message is no longer, "This is what I need," but "This is how little you matter now." In families, where identity and attachment are intertwined, that interpretation cuts deeply. Many conflicts escalate because the person setting the boundary underestimates the emotional impact of how it is delivered. Efficiency replaces empathy. Decisions are announced rather than discussed. Explanations are withheld in the name of simplicity. Yet what feels like simplicity to one person often feels like erasure to another. Belonging does not require unlimited access, but it does require acknowledgement. When acknowledgement is missing, boundaries can feel like doors quietly closing. At the same time, it is important to recognize that not all feelings of rejection mean a boundary was wrong. Sometimes the discomfort arises because the family system is changing, and change destabilizes familiar roles. Adult relationships require a renegotiation of closeness. What once was automatic now requires intention. When families fail to update their emotional agreements, boundaries feel abrupt rather than developmental. The pain, then, is not just about the limit itself, but about the loss of an unexamined assumption: "I will always be included in the same way." This is where education becomes essential. Understanding that boundaries are not verdicts on love, but tools for sustainability, allows families to interpret them more accurately. A limit is not the same as exclusion. Saying "this does not work for me" is different from saying "you do not belong." However, the burden of clarity does not rest solely on the listener. Those who set boundaries have a responsibility to communicate them with relational intelligence. This includes naming the connection, not just the constraint. When boundaries are paired with relational language, their impact changes. A limit that says, "This is what we've decided, and it doesn't change how much you matter to us," lands differently than one that simply states the outcome. The content may be the same, but the emotional experience is not. Belonging is preserved not by access, but by tone, timing, and care. Within families, the fear of being replaced is especially potent. As new partnerships form and priorities shift, older bonds can feel suddenly fragile. Boundaries introduced during these transitions carry more emotional weight than intended. Without reassurance, they can feel like confirmation of a long-standing fear that love is conditional on usefulness, proximity, or agreement. This is why poorly communicated limits often trigger disproportionate reactions. They are not just about the present moment, but about unresolved emotional narratives. Learning to distinguish between a boundary and a rejection is a skill that develops with emotional maturity. It requires the ability to tolerate disappointment without translating it into abandonment. It also requires trust that the relationship is strong enough to hold change. Families that struggle most with boundaries are often those where belonging was never verbally affirmed, only implied. When circumstances change, the implication collapses, and nothing explicit remains to support it. Equally important is the ability to set boundaries without using them as shields against discomfort. Sometimes people hide behind just setting boundaries to avoid difficult conversations. When boundaries become substitutes for dialogue, they lose their integrity. True boundaries are not shortcuts, they are frameworks that support honest connection. They invite adjustment, not withdrawal. In healthy family systems, belonging is not proven through constant inclusion, and boundaries are not enforced through emotional distance. Both coexist through communication that respects autonomy without threatening attachment. This balance is not achieved once, but continuously recalibrated as relationships evolve. Ultimately, the harm does not come from boundaries themselves, but from the emotional vacuum in which they are delivered. When limits are set without context, care, or compassion, they can feel indistinguishable from rejection. When they are rooted in clarity and accompanied by reassurance, they become acts of respect for oneself and for the relationship. The deeper lesson is this: belonging does not mean unlimited access, and boundaries do not mean diminished love. But without conscious communication, families often confuse the two. Learning to separate them is not just a relational skill, it is an emotional education that protects dignity, preserves connection, and allows relationships to grow without leaving people behind. Assumptions are among the most powerful and least examined forces in human relationships. They operate quietly, without declaration, shaping expectations and interpretations long before a single word is spoken. Unlike explicit agreements, assumptions feel self-evident to the person holding them. They do not announce themselves as beliefs, they present themselves as truth. This is why misunderstandings born of assumptions often feel shocking. Each person believes they are responding reasonably, while the relationship fractures in the space between what was expected and what was actually communicated. In families, assumptions take root early and deepen over time. Roles are learned through repetition rather than discussion. Who belongs where, who is consulted, who is included, and who is expected to adapt are rarely articulated. They are absorbed. A parent assumes their presence is implicit. A child assumes autonomy will be granted without emotional cost. A partner assumes loyalty means prioritization. None of these assumptions are inherently wrong, but when they remain unspoken, they become rigid. When circumstances change, they do not adjust on their own. The danger of assumptions is not that they exist, but that they are invisible. People rarely argue about assumptions directly. They argue about outcomes. One person feels excluded, another feels misunderstood. One feels entitled, another feels overwhelmed. Because the underlying expectations were never named, the conflict appears to come out of nowhere. What looks like sudden insensitivity is often the collision of two unspoken narratives. Assumptions about roles are particularly influential. Families operate on informal hierarchies that shift across life stages, yet those shifts are rarely acknowledged. A parent may assume continued involvement as a sign of love. An adult child may assume reduced involvement as a sign of independence. When these assumptions collide, each side experiences the other as unreasonable. The parent feels pushed aside, the child feels controlled. Neither intended harm, but harm occurs because expectations were never recalibrated. Assumptions about inclusion are equally potent. Inclusion is not just logistical, it is symbolic. Being invited, consulted, or informed carries emotional meaning beyond the event itself. When inclusion is assumed rather than clarified, its absence can feel personal even when it was not meant to be. The person who assumed inclusion experiences its absence as rejection. The person who assumed exclusion experiences the reaction as overreach. Both are responding to their internal logic, unaware that it was never shared. Hierarchy adds another layer of complexity. Families often avoid discussing hierarchy openly because it feels uncomfortable or outdated. Yet unspoken hierarchies still exist and exert influence. Who gets to decide? Whose comfort is prioritized? Whose preferences are considered flexible? And whose are treated as fixed? When hierarchy is assumed rather than negotiated, power dynamics become opaque. Decisions are made, reactions are emotional, and no one can quite explain why the situation feels so charged. The silent nature of assumptions makes them especially damaging because they resist correction. When something is spoken, it can be clarified, challenged, or revised. When something is assumed, it hides beneath the surface, shaping interpretations without accountability. People defend their reactions without realizing they are defending an expectation the other person never agreed to. This is why assumptions so often masquerade as moral judgments. A disappointed person may conclude, "If you cared, you would have known." A defensive person may think, "If you were reasonable, you wouldn't expect that." These conclusions turn misalignment into character assessment. The relationship shifts from curiosity to blame, even though the original issue was informational, not ethical. Assumptions also have a cumulative effect. Each unaddressed disappointment adds to an internal ledger. Over time, people stop responding to the present moment and start reacting to a pattern that exists mostly in their own mind. The other person, unaware of this internal history, feels blindsided by the intensity of the response. What looks like an overreaction is often the release of many unmet, unspoken expectations. Education around assumptions requires a shift in how we interpret discomfort. Instead of asking, "Who is wrong?" the more productive question is, "What was assumed?" This reframes conflict as a gap in communication rather than a failure of care. It invites inquiry instead of defense. It also places responsibility where it belongs, on shared understanding, not mind reading. Making assumptions visible is an act of relational maturity. It requires naming expectations without accusation. It involves replacing "you should have known" with "I realized I expected this" without saying it. This kind of language transforms conflict into collaboration. It acknowledges that disappointment can exist without implying malice. Equally important is the willingness to challenge one's own assumptions. Many people treat their expectations as natural extensions of love or respect, when in fact they are products of personal history, cultural norms, or past family structures. What feels obvious to one person may feel intrusive or irrelevant to another. Recognizing this does not invalidate the expectation, it contextualizes it. When assumptions about roles, inclusion, and hierarchy are brought into the open, relationships become more flexible. People gain the opportunity to renegotiate rather than rupture. They can decide together what belongs to the past and what needs updating. Without this process, families remain trapped in outdated scripts, repeating conflicts that feel inevitable but are actually avoidable. The silent power of assumptions lies in their ability to shape emotional reality without ever being spoken. They influence how actions are interpreted, how intentions are judged, and how closeness is measured. Left unexamined, they quietly fracture relationships, not through cruelty, but through neglect of clarity. Learning to surface assumptions is not about eliminating disappointment. It is about preventing misunderstanding from becoming distance. It is an educational practice in emotional literacy, one that teaches people to distinguish between what was promised and what was presumed. In doing so, it restores dialogue where silence once governed and allows relationships to evolve with awareness rather than resentment. Dignity is often misunderstood as something we assert loudly, as though respect must be claimed through confrontation or secured through forceful expression. In reality, dignity is most clearly revealed in moments when emotion surges and restraint is chosen instead of reaction. It is not the absence of feeling, but the decision not to let feeling dictate behavior. Emotional maturity emerges not when we prove we are right, but when we protect our inner stability in situations that invite us to lose it. Reaction is fast. It is fueled by surprise, hurt, and the instinct to defend the self against perceived threat. When something feels unfair or dismissive, the body responds before the mind has time to interpret. Heart rate increases, thoughts narrow, and the urge to respond immediately feels urgent and justified. Reaction promises relief. It offers the illusion of regaining control by pushing emotion outward. Yet this relief is temporary, and it often comes at the cost of self-respect. Response, by contrast, requires pause. It creates space between stimulus and action. In that space, reflection becomes possible. Reflection does not erase pain, it organizes it. It allows a person to ask not only, "What do I feel?" but "What will this response cost me later?" Dignity lives in that second question. It is the quiet awareness that while words can wound others, they can also wound the self. Impulsive defense often masquerades as strength. It sounds like clarity, decisiveness, and honesty. But when defense is driven by injury rather than intention, it tends to escalate rather than resolve. The person reacting may feel momentarily powerful, yet afterward experience regret, shame, or a sense of having abandoned their values. Emotional maturity recognizes that not every provocation requires engagement, and not every misunderstanding requires immediate correction. Preserving dignity does not mean suppressing emotion or accepting mistreatment. It means choosing how and when to express emotion in a way that aligns with one's long-term sense of self. A calm response is not passive, it is deliberate. It signals that one's worth is not dependent on winning the moment. This is particularly important in relational conflicts, where reactions can quickly shift the focus from the original issue to the manner in which it was addressed. Reflection allows a person to separate the event from its interpretation. What happened is one thing, what it means is another. Reaction collapses these two into one. Response keeps them distinct. This distinction prevents the mind from filling gaps with assumptions and prevents the mouth from turning pain into accusation. Dignity is preserved when a person resists the urge to narrate the other's intentions without evidence. Calm reflection also protects relationships from unnecessary damage. Words spoken in reactivity are difficult to retract. Even when apologies follow, the emotional residue often remains. A restrained response, even if delayed, carries more weight and is more likely to be heard. It communicates seriousness without hostility and confidence without contempt. In this way, restraint becomes a form of self-respect that does not require validation from the other person. There is also a deeper layer to dignified response. It prevents the erosion of one's internal authority. When individuals react impulsively, they often hand control of their behavior to external triggers. Their emotional state becomes dictated by others' actions. Response reclaims that authority. It affirms that while we cannot control what happens to us, we can control how we participate in what happens next. This practice is particularly challenging in situations involving perceived rejection or injustice. The impulse to explain, justify, or protest can be overwhelming. Yet dignity asks a different question. Is this moment about being understood or about staying aligned with who I am? Sometimes the need to be understood immediately conflicts with the need to remain grounded. Choosing grounding over gratification is an advanced emotional skill. Restraint is often misinterpreted by others as indifference or weakness. In truth, it is neither. It is the discipline of not allowing a moment to define the entire narrative of a relationship or of the self. A restrained response leaves room for future dialogue. It keeps doors open rather than slamming them in a moment of pain. Importantly, dignity in response does not require silence forever. It requires timing. Silence can be a form of reflection, not avoidance. When the nervous system settles, the mind can articulate experience with greater accuracy. What emerges then is not defense, but clarity. This clarity is more persuasive than any argument made in anger. Over time, people who consistently respond rather than react develop a reputation for steadiness. Their words are taken seriously because they are not scattered or excessive. Their boundaries are respected because they are not constantly redrawn in moments of emotional volatility. This steadiness is not innate, it is practiced. It is learned through repeated decisions to pause, reflect, and choose alignment over impulse. Dignity, ultimately, is an internal experience. It is the sense of not having betrayed oneself in the heat of emotion. It is the quiet relief of knowing that even in discomfort, one acted with intention. This inner consistency becomes a source of resilience. When external circumstances feel unstable, internal dignity provides continuity. Emotional maturity does not eliminate pain, but it transforms how pain is carried. Instead of broadcasting it through reaction, mature response contains it, examines it, and expresses it when expression can serve understanding rather than escalation. In this way, dignity is not something granted by others. It is something maintained through the disciplined choice to respond with awareness, even when reaction feels justified. The narrative lesson is clear. Self-respect is not preserved by winning arguments or proving points. It is preserved by the ability to remain composed when composure is most difficult. In choosing response over reaction, a person protects not only the relationship, but the integrity of their own emotional life. Adulthood transforms family not through rupture, but through redefinition. When children grow up and form families of their own, the structure that once organized closeness, authority, and responsibility quietly dissolves. What replaces it is not automatically clear. This uncertainty is where much emotional tension arises, not because love has diminished, but because the meaning of connection has changed. Redefining family in adulthood requires a careful renegotiation of identity, relevance, and connection, particularly for parents who must learn how to remain present without presiding. For many parents, identity has long been intertwined with being needed. Parenting is, for years, a role defined by indispensability. Decisions revolve around the child, time is organized around care, and emotional energy is poured into guidance and protection. When adulthood arrives, that centrality recedes. The child no longer requires constant oversight, and the parental role loses its former authority. This shift can feel like a loss of self rather than a natural transition. Without reflection, parents may attempt to reclaim relevance through proximity, opinion, or involvement that no longer fits. The challenge is not to withdraw, nor to insist on the old role, but to evolve it. Relevance in adult family relationships is not established through control or constant presence. It is established through respect. Parents who adapt successfully understand that influence now flows through trust rather than direction. They become valued not because they must be consulted, but because their presence is emotionally safe and their contributions are offered, not imposed. Entitlement often emerges when this transition is resisted. Entitlement sounds like assuming access without invitation, expecting inclusion without conversation, or interpreting autonomy as ingratitude. These reactions are usually rooted in fear rather than malice, the fear of becoming invisible, replaceable, or irrelevant. Yet acting from entitlement, paradoxically, accelerates the very distance it seeks to prevent. Adult children often pull away not from closeness itself, but from closeness that does not respect boundaries. At the same time, the opposite extreme, self-erasure, carries its own cost. Some parents respond to this transition by disappearing emotionally, believing that restraint requires silence or that dignity requires withdrawal. They minimize their needs, avoid expression, and reduce themselves to spectators in their children's lives. While this may prevent conflict, it also erodes authenticity. Relationships built on self-erasure lack vitality and mutuality. Over time, they can feel hollow, marked by politeness rather than connection. The educational task, then, is balance. Redefining family in adulthood means learning how to stay connected without overstepping, and how to remain visible without dominating. It requires parents to locate their worth outside of constant involvement and to trust that their significance does not depend on proximity or permission. This redefinition also involves accepting a shift in hierarchy. Adult families are no longer vertical structures where authority flows in one direction. They become horizontal, requiring negotiation rather than instruction. This can feel disorienting for parents who were once decision makers. Letting go of hierarchy does not mean losing respect. It means redefining it. Respect in adulthood is mutual, not automatic. It is earned through listening, adaptability, and emotional regulation. Connection, in this new structure, is maintained through invitation rather than expectation. Parents who wait to be invited rather than inserting themselves communicate confidence rather than insecurity. They signal trust in the relationship's durability. This does not mean suppressing desire for closeness. It means expressing it without pressure. Saying, "I'd love to be part of this if it works for you," preserves dignity on both sides. It allows adult children to choose connection freely rather than comply out of obligation. Redefining family also requires grieving what no longer exists. The earlier phase of parenting, with its intensity and centrality, does not return. Ignoring this grief can turn it into resentment. Acknowledging it allows parents to move forward without clinging to the past. Grief, when recognized, becomes a passage rather than a trap. Adult children, for their part, often underestimate the emotional impact of this transition on parents. They may assume independence is self-explanatory and fail to communicate reassurance. This gap can widen distance unnecessarily. However, parents cannot rely on their children to manage this transition for them. Emotional maturity involves self-reflection, recognizing one's own fears without outsourcing their resolution. When parents successfully renegotiate identity, they often discover unexpected freedom. Life expands beyond the parental role. Interests resurface. Relationships diversify. Purpose becomes less singular. This expansion enriches family relationships rather than diminishing them. A parent who is fulfilled beyond their children brings less pressure into the connection and more presence into the moments they share. Redefining family in adulthood is not a single conversation but an ongoing process. Each life stage, partnerships, careers, grandchildren, aging, requires adjustment. Families that thrive are not those that cling to sameness, but those that adapt with curiosity and humility. At its core, this keynote teaches that lasting connection in adulthood is built on voluntary closeness, not inherited obligation. Parents remain essential not by insisting on their role, nor by erasing themselves from the narrative, but by evolving with it. They honor the past without demanding its continuation, and they invest in the present without fear of becoming unnecessary. In doing so, family becomes less about roles and more about relationship, less about authority and more about mutual regard. This redefinition is not a loss. It is a maturation. And when navigated with self-awareness, it allows family bonds to endure not because they must, but because they are chosen.